Sir Richard Breedlove is a former head of the British intelligence agency MI6. Welcome to our program, Sir Richard Breedlove.
Very nice to be with you, and thank you for inviting me.
North Korea has started sending 12,000 soldiers to Ukraine to fight against the Ukrainian army alongside with the Russian forces. According to the South Korea intelligence agency, it would be North Korea's first major participation in a foreign war. What is your reaction to this?
Well, I'm disturbed and troubled by the news, and of course it's unprecedented. The North Koreans have never sent soldiers overseas before. However, I would make a couple of points which I think is important to keep in mind. I mean, the first is this looks a bit like an act of desperation on the part of the Russians. Why on earth would they need the support of North Korean soldiers? So it sort of implies, I think, that they have manpower problems with their own military. The second point I would make is, I mean, these North Korean forces are untried. I don't think they've fought a war. They haven't fought overseas. My immediate thought is how many of them are going to defect to the West when they get to Ukraine? They haven't been outside North Korea before. They've led a very sheltered life. And it strikes me there's an element of gesture politics in this, or publicity for the North Korean Russian maybe alliance. Well, it isn't alliance, but it's worrying. But on the other hand, there are indicators that make one think, well, maybe it's something that could actually, in the medium term, to play to Ukraine's advantage.
How could they play into Ukraine's advantage?
Because it shows, desperation on the part of the Russians. I mean, who on earth in normal circumstances would invite soldiers from across a continent who are completely untried, who have never been seen outside North Korea, who have no experience in fighting a land war? They are, frankly, an unknown quantity.
From your perspective, how can you assess the Western response to this? Why is the West so soft on Russia and North Korea? We haven't seen any kind of a major response to this.
Well, I think it's early days yet. I'm sure that you will get some pretty clear statements. I mean, we've only just got the news. There hasn't been, as far as I know, any official announcement from North Korea or from Russia. This is something which is verified by South Korean intelligence. I'm sure there'll be government reaction to it once we have a clearer picture of what's happening, what exactly these troops are, what equipment they've got. I mean, there are all sorts of questions that are unanswered. And I think it's very early days. There will be, I'm sure, outright condemnation.
From your perspective, should we expect any kind of other response in a military way, providing Ukraine with authorization to use, for example, Western-made weapons deep inside Russia?
Well, I'm certainly of the view that we should be giving Ukraine agreement to use longer-range missiles into Russian targets. I mean, it's important to damage Russia's logistical bases in this war. And I mean, this would apply, for example, to North Korean troops. I mean, they will be a target. And I think, maybe their experience is going to be a very difficult one in the face of a very formidable Ukrainian military response. I mean, I'm sure the Ukrainians are not going to take this sitting down. And we'll be looking very clearly at this as a specific, if you wish, a propaganda target.
Does the West have enough means to prevent further escalation in such cooperation between Russia and North Korea? Can the West prevent North Korea to deploying even more soldiers to the battlefield in Ukraine?
Well, I think if we were going in that direction and there was a clear commitment that the North Koreans were going to get heavily involved in this war, it's the sort of thing which could trigger a change of decision, certainly in the United States, about the use of longer range weapons. And the supply of those weapons, the use of those weapons might be, as it were, the means to solving the problem of a bigger North Korean deployment. I mean, as I said just now, I'm pretty sure at this stage this is almost, a gesture. Whether it's a significant military development remains to be seen. And, how on earth are these North Korean soldiers who've led a very strange, they come from a regime which is very isolated, almost autistic in its character. How on earth are they going to respond to fighting on a Western battlefield?
Also, we have heard some reports about the desertion of the North Korean troops inside Russia. 18 North Korean soldiers fled from the battlefield inside Russia. However, they were caught and detained by the Russian authorities. Do you expect more desertion among the North Korean soldiers, and what does the North Korean regime think about this?
Well, of course, it's a risk, because the problem, if you're inside North Korea, is getting out. It's very difficult. If you've been to the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, which I have done, not recently, but many years ago, there are always North Korean soldiers who very occasionally, do escape and run across the border. There is a constant pressure. There are North Koreans defecting into China. Once they see an opportunity, I wouldn't be at all surprised if this turns into a major problem. Maybe the Ukrainian army are going to end up with a platoon of defecting North Korean soldiers fighting on their side. But let's wait and see what happens. This is a very strange development from a very strange country. These troops are an unknown quantity. They've never been exposed to the West before. They have a very sheltered background, and it'll be very interesting to see how they react. But personally, as I said, this could be a propaganda opportunity for Ukraine, which could be beneficial to their position.
From your perspective, is Kim Jong-un aware of this fact of deployment of his troops to the battlefield? Maybe he had some discussion with Russians and they promised only to train them.
Oh, no, I'm sure that there would have been an agreement. I mean, I cannot believe that they were, as it were, sent just for training and then suddenly found themselves being deployed by the Russians without agreement. No, this is no question an agreement between probably Putin and the North Korean leader. There's more to that than it's not just some trick on the Russian part to use North Korean soldiers.
From your perspective, how could the Russians integrate North Korean soldiers in its own war effort? I mean, how can they overcome language barrier, for example?
With great difficulty. Korean is a very complex language. I have one or two friends who are brilliant linguists, and they say that Korean is one of the most difficult languages to learn and to speak well. I think that question of integration will be a huge problem. Okay, they'll have Russian liaison officers with them. They will have some interpreters. But on the battlefield, that can be quite a problem.
I would like also to cover Kremlin and Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin may be suffering from Parkinson's disease, according to your sources in Eastern Europe. How does this disease influence Putin's decision-making, his actions?
Well, I said that a long time ago, and I'm not prepared to go into who I discussed this with and who told me. But I'm not a clinician. But Parkinson's has many manifestations, and the disease can develop slowly. It can change pace. One of the characteristics of Parkinson's is to affect judgment and rationality, or it can do that. I'm sure that if Putin has got Parkinson's, he has obviously the best specialists in Russia treating him and medicating him. And certainly in those circumstances, you can live for a long time with Parkinson's. And you can, to an extent, hide the symptoms. But I wouldn't say anything more than that at this stage, except, I think in a more general sense, Putin's so-called special military operation has turned out to be a disaster for Russia, both domestically and internationally. And he's in a very difficult place because he can't really go backwards. He can only go forwards and continue with the war. And if you wish to use an English idiom, he's digging himself deeper and deeper into a hole. And maybe, if he is ill, impaired judgment can explain where we are today. But I'm not prepared to say that definitely. This is speculation. Okay, maybe informed speculation, but it is speculation.
Does it mean that he does not have a way out of this situation, of this war, from a political point of view and military one?
I can't see a way out at the moment for him, unless there's a willingness on the part of Ukraine to negotiate. And I don't see evidence of that at all on the Ukrainian side. And I don't see a willingness for Russia to negotiate unless Russia asserts exactly what it wants. That's Putin's line at the moment. He is being, he says, I'll stop the war, but give me what I need and what I want.
It seems like he does not want to have anything less than capitulation of Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that's probably correct. And I can't see Ukraine being willing to surrender territory on a permanent basis to Russia either. So it seems to me that we are a long way from a negotiation to settle this, the Russian invasion and violation of Ukrainian sovereignty.
Do you see the possibility for negotiations in any time in the future? Can you rule out this possibility due to the Putin's line?
The answer to that is I don't think we know. I'm not really prepared to speculate. If the West is not, at the moment, it worries me, meeting Ukraine's defense and strategic needs as fully as it should. There is a worrying aspect to the conflict. We obviously have, in a few weeks' time, a US presidential election. We do not know how the new United States president, whichever one it is going to be, will, as it were, react towards Ukraine. But I'm hoping that the West's support will remain solid. It will be increased in the future, and that we will not allow Putin to be able to claim that he has won this war or has secured a victory or secured his objectives. I think it's very important for the security of Europe, very important for the security of the West as a whole, very important for international security that Putin does not claim a victory in this conflict, this stealing of Ukrainian territory.
Russia's war against Ukraine has eroded Putin's grip on power, according to the director of the CIA. What is your take on that, on Putin's grip on power?
Well, it's very difficult to see behind the scenes in the Kremlin. And remember, I've now been retired for quite some time, so I don't have access to specific intelligence. It's interesting that the director of the CIA should say that publicly, because it must indicate that he does have some intelligence that points in that direction. All I would say is that I would imagine that the situation within the Kremlin leadership at the moment, I wouldn't call it fragile, but I would call it brittle. There must be huge strains and stresses amongst the leadership around Putin, because he has put Russia in such an impossibly difficult position. The Russian economy, militarily, internationally, Russia now is very isolated. It's very much the supplicant power in its relations with China. And looking ahead, it doesn't look to me as though the situation will improve for Putin. So we can imagine behind the scenes the tension and the difficulty that must be there.
President Zelensky has presented his victory plan to end the war in Ukraine. He says that this plan could end the war even next year by putting more pressure on Russia, by allowing Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia, by inviting Ukraine to join NATO, and even providing Ukraine with more support. What is your personal opinion on this initiative of President Zelensky?
Well, the first point I would say is I'm totally in sympathy with his view about the West's need to supply Ukraine with the weapons that it needs and to permit their use so that Ukraine can carry the war deeper into Russia and, as it were, attack the logistic bases of the Russian military. I think this obviously would make a huge difference to the progress militarily at the moment, where you have something of a stalemate and actually Russian advance, not strategic advance, but small tactical advances in the Donbass region. So that's that is, it looks to me as though that's the sort of state of play in a military sense. As regards membership of NATO, this is a much more complex issue because of Article 5 of the NATO treaty and the fact that you cannot have a country joining that has a major territorial or border dispute with a neighbor. I think that in due course, if you take a longer term view, yes, I think that Ukraine probably inevitably has to join NATO. But the question is what steps you take towards that decision. And I think it has to be, first of all, maybe preceded by security guarantees for Ukraine before we actually get onto the issue of NATO membership. I know that's a pretty tough thing to say, but I mean, Article 5 is pretty clear about, as it were, applicant members not having a major border dispute. And I'm afraid that Ukraine, in that respect, for the moment at least, is disqualified. But this doesn't mean it shouldn't have very solid Western support. And that situation could change quite quickly if Russia is driven back and Ukraine reclaims a good proportion or the majority of its territory, if not all of it.
I would like also to cover again the Kremlin. From your perspective, what could happen in case of Putin's departure?
Tough question. I don't think we really know. There are obviously powerful individuals around Putin. The one I would expect to succeed him, if there is some sort of palace coup against Putin personally, would be Patrushev, who used to be head of the FSB and who many years ago I dealt with. He's been around for a long time. I think what I would say is if there's a political change in Russia, it depends on the nature of that change, whether it's an internal event in the Kremlin or something more broad. maybe involving the general staff of the Russian army. It's very difficult to say and very difficult to imagine. At the moment, I think a more likely scenario is some sort of palace coup, where there's a changing of the guard, Putin goes, and possibly not a great deal would then change in terms of Russian policy towards the war in Ukraine, unless, and we don't know this, there's a faction that thinks that this war is so destructive of Russian capability in the medium to long term that there has to be some sort of exit.
Could Putin face a physical threat to his life in case of some coup?
Well, if you look at Russian history, and I would look at Russian history in this context, the mechanisms for political change are non-existent. So there's no mechanism for democratic change. And I would have thought in the circumstances one is looking at something which would be more violent and disruptive. The only point I would make is that in recent times, both Yeltsin and Gorbachev left power alive.
And what is your take on the possibility for Ukraine to target Russia's military chain of command and political leaders?
Well, I think we've seen in the case of Israel the impact of targeting individuals. Ukraine has developed a hugely sophisticated drone capability, probably amongst the best in the world now, in which there is a lot of military interest. And I think there's an opportunity here for Western investment in this burgeoning industry. And I am sure that there are bits of Ukrainian intelligence that are thinking about attacking individuals and, as it were, raising the cost to the command of the Russian army of the war in Ukraine. It's a natural thing to do. And the Israelis have already demonstrated how effective it can be if you go after the leadership. Okay, not in this case of conventional armies, in their case, more terrorist movements and non-governmental movements which have a terrorist profile. But yeah, Ukraine could do that. Can I make one point, I think, which is important? I mentioned the possibility of Western investment in Ukrainian defense industries, and I think there's a huge interest in this. But it's important that Ukraine continues to concentrate on cleaning up corruption in government if it's to encourage Westerners to come in and, as it were, support significantly and jointly Ukrainian defense industries. And I know there's been some improvement in that side, but it's still important that Ukraine follows this through.
Thank you, Sir Richard Girilov, for your time and for supporting Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Yeah, well, I very much hope that despite the difficult war and the fact that it's been running since 2014, Ukraine emerges victorious. Some of us think this is essential and very important, and we're prepared to do all we can to support your country.
Thank you.